Welcome back. In this video we are going to discuss using optionals. We will cover what optionals are and why we would want to use an optional instead of giving the variable that we declare a default value. First, let's cover what an optional is. An optional either has some value or it has no value. So you might wonder, why would this be useful? So before looking at an example, let's look at an optional behind the scenes. So an optional behind the scenes is really just an enum, and we're going to call this our optional. That way we don't conflict with Apple's optional. And it takes in this generic type of t. So this may look a little bizarre at first, so don't pay too much attention to it. Just know that we're going to have a case that has some value that takes in a value, and a case that has no value, called none. This is a little more advanced than what we have covered so far, and I wouldn't worry too much about it until you're more comfortable with using optionals. So maybe at the end of the course come back and take a look at what an optional is behind the scene. So it takes an initializer that takes in a value, and then we just set our self to some and whatever the value is. And we also have this empty initializer if the value is nil. So now when we go ahead and create our optional value, we can say our optional string equals our optional, and it's going to be some string called hello. So now that we are defining this our optional with hello, passing it into our initializer here, self can be set to some value of value, and value is being passed into t, so t now takes the type of string because it can infer that type based off of the string that we passed into our optional. So if we click on our optional string, we can see it's our optional with the type of string. So that t is now string. If we wanted to create a nil, we can say var our nil string equals our optional, and we can pass in the empty initializer. But notice we get an error saying that the generic parameter t could not be inferred. So we actually have to tell it that it's a string by passing in string to these angle brackets. So now if we look, we can see our nil string is of type our optional string. Luckily, you don't have to know about all of this because it's all behind the scenes done for you, and the compiler allows you to bridge certain operators to be able to use with optionals to make it more easily readable and easier to abstract those values out or extract those values out. So let's take a look at an example using the Swift language, and also an example of when it might be useful to use an optional instead of a value. So let's say we have a person, and a person will have a given name, and a person will have a surname. So this is their first and last name. But sometimes a person will also have a middle name, but they won't always have a middle name. So we could make that a string and then make it an empty string. But if they don't have a last name, then we want to know that they don't have a last name. So we're going to make this an optional. So if they don't have a last name, we can set this optional to nil. So we can set that by default to nil, and then we can say that the person's full name is going to be a string, and we will return our given name, our middle name, and our surname. Now we can create our person, so I will create Mike, and we can use the person initializer, and we can say Michael. For the middle name, we can put James, and for the last name, Huber. And now if we print Mike.fullname, it will say Michael optional James Huber. So that's because when you use an optional value, in this case middle name, is not unwrapped yet, so it still holds that optional value, and you first have to unwrap it to be able to use that value correctly. One way, which is very bad practice and you should never do, is to use an exclamation point. And you can say middle name exclamation point, and that will say that this has a value and I know that it has a value, so I'm going to put exclamation point here. But what happens if instead of passing in James to the middle name, we pass in nil? So now that exclamation point will actually crash the app because we are trying to unwrap a value that holds nil, which has no value, and we are telling it with this exclamation point that we know that it has a value, but since it doesn't, it just crashes the app. So we never want to use the exclamation point. But now, since this value has nil, it's no longer optional, it's just no value. In the next video, we are going to cover ways to unwrap this value to be able to use it. So for now, we will just leave it as showing our optional value until the next video. Now that we know what optionals are, in the next video we will cover unwrapping optionals. That way we don't crash our app. See you then.